Just hi everyone. I'm Sanskriti, and I work as a project manager here at Center for Civil Society in the research department. And I'm really happy to welcome every one of you to the Fireside Chat. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we really look forward for an exciting Fireside Chat discussion with Parth and Dhiraj. I will quickly introduce the speakers to the audience. Dr. Shah is the founder and president of Center for Civil Society and co-founder of Indian School of Public Policy. His research and advocacy work centers on the themes of economic freedom, choice, and competition in education, property rights approach for environment, and good governance. He has conceptualized and organized liberal educational programs for the Indian youth, including Liberty and Society seminars, Jivika Livelihood documentary competition, and the Researching Reality internship program. He's also on the editorial board of Education World, Vishleshan, and Coach. Parth is also an informal advisor to many nonprofit organizations and is also the youngest Indian member of the Mont Pelerin Society. We welcome you, Parth. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Dr. Nayyar is an economist and he is currently serving as the chief economist and director of policy at Vedanta Resources. With a diverse career spanning academia, media, and government, he was previously officer on special duty at Niti Aayog as a chief economist. Dr. Nayyar has also held editorial roles at leading media outlets and has been awarded the Bastiat Prize in Journalism by the Reason Foundation. His prolific writing extends to publications worldwide, including best-selling works like Surviving the Storm, India and the Global Financial Crisis, among various others. Thank you so much, Dhiraj, for joining us. Before I know all of us are looking forward to this exciting discussion, but before we proceed towards the fireside chat, a small request to all the participants. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop in your questions in the Q&A box. That is there on Zoom. And in case you have a question similar to the one that has been already asked, please upvote that question and the same will be taken up by the speakers. Now I will request Dhiraj and Parth to please, take up the discussion. And we are really excited to know your thoughts on the themes presented in the Freedom and Prosperity Equation book, and also the insightful CCS essay featured in the book titled Understanding India's Freedom on Path to Prosperity. So yes, we welcome you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me, and there's Parth showing his handiwork. So Parth is, for those of you, I'm sure a lot of you know him, but he's one of our freedom fighters, as I like to call him. We only associate it with our political freedom, but, there's the whole domain of economic freedom, which we are still, fighting for greater freedom all around. Obviously the, the book and the chapter written by Parth in it has some very interesting, findings. And I think one of the interesting things you've done, Parth, is that you've, obviously these are, all of these things are subjective and you rank and, make indices. But what you said is that you're not comparing India, with some ideal West, or what you call the frontier, but you're comparing it with similar income countries, South Asia region, global average. So it's a much more reasonable outcome, therefore, in terms of what the findings are. And you very clearly say that these are just findings. You're not really diagnosing. It's a diagnosis, but you're not really going into the whys and the what can be done. But maybe we'll tackle some of that over here. So I think the chapter and the equation in itself covers three freedoms: political, legal, and economic. And I think one of the things you say at the start, and I'd like to start with that, is that a lot of us who work on India or talk about India say that India is an exception. The Indian exceptionalism argument that we are a noisy democracy, we are a 5,000-year civilization. Various reasons for why we aren't where we ought to be. And you interestingly say that while all of those things may be true, they are largely irrelevant to what is going on in terms of freedom. So could you just tell us a little bit about this entire why you think India is not really an exception, or it may be an exception, but it doesn't really matter for its sort of prosperous future.
Thank you, Dhiraj, and of course, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. And I'm really excited about the book and the arguments which are in the book, not just from the chapter from India, obviously, is written by Prashant and me, but there are of course chapters for many countries, and some of them are quite interesting. So as I was sort of talking to the various people involved in the project that the Atlantic Council has put together, I realized the moment you say what lessons can we learn from looking around the world, right? And this idea of Indian exceptionalism always pops up. So you can say China has done this, and maybe this is something we should learn from China. Immediately, the answer is, well, China is not a democracy, but we are a noisy democracy, right? You talk about any country for that matter, there's always something that's been pointed out that we are different. And of course, that's really true, right? China is not a democracy and we are a democracy. But is that really relevant to the argument, right? So if somebody says, even within a non-democratic system like China, largely the reason for their economic success, right, is how Deng Xiaoping and others sort of open up the Chinese economy, right? Much of the growth of Chinese economy is because of the international trade, despite being one of the largest country until recently, right? With the most populous country, it didn't depend on indigenous consumption, right? That wasn't the model they followed. Now one can argue that the Chinese didn't think about those models. They were sort of got carried away with the World Bank and IMF and the Western ideas of growing through trade. Probably not, right? They could have option of doing what, depending completely on the internal growth, but they did not obviously follow that path, right? And so to me, it looks like every time we sort of pick an example of success story, a lesson that one could talk about, this sort of, in a sense, bogey of Indian exceptionalism comes up. And so that's really we're trying to get putting it out there up front, right? In the chapter, we are not trying to compare with any single country, right?
Yeah.
As you see, what we did, right, is to say, okay, what's the easiest way to compare what India has done with the outside world, which could be, well, at least less objectionable from this point of view, right? And therefore, we looked at, for example, global average. What's a global average score on a particular parameters of freedom, right? We looked at the lower middle income country average. So India is, of course, by World Bank definition, a lower middle income country, right? So what's the average for those countries? And we also looked at what's the average for South Asia. So the 8 countries of South Asia, and see what the average is. And if India is lower than all 3 averages in some significant manner, then it's sort of hard to argue that we cannot do better than what we have done in those areas. So we sort of chose that route of lowest hanging fruit to be able to build an argument about what lessons are there that the index sort of gives us.
I think, it's interesting, and political freedom is, of course, India's relative strength, say, compared with China, but other countries have done probably much better with lesser degrees of political freedom than India. I mean, China is, of course, just one example, but there's a lot of East Asian examples. But I think, the one thing which struck me more than political freedom, which is more or less, which is not such a bad performance, is the legal freedom really struck me. And I think it's something which is not discussed, as as its own kind of problem. Kind of gets conflated with various other issues. But I think, like, one of the things which clearly comes out is whether it's civil justice, criminal justice, quality of investigation, the time taken for adjudication, all of these things we rate very, very, very poorly. Now, I just had a thought here that, one of the things with our legal system when it was set up, I'm not a legal expert, but from what I understand is that, the founding fathers or the jurists of the time believed that it was better in a country like India to, give access in the sense of people being able to approach even the highest court, like the Supreme Court. In a lot of the countries like the US Supreme Court hears very, very few cases. I mean, only the kind of constitutional or serious points of law. They don't rehear every case. But I think in India, it was deliberately kept open. So, I mean, is there, in terms of when you look at legal freedom, of course, we know that these are the facts that justice takes a long time. It's often not delivered. Investigation standards are poor. But do you think there's a kind of uneasy uh, what do I say? I mean, is it an uneasy mix? I mean, can a quick justice system sit with access for 1.4 billion people?
Yeah. No, I think it's a great question. And I think as you see in the argument that we have built, legal freedom comes out to be one of the key lowest hanging fruit, broadly speaking, among all three freedoms, right? But I think before we go into details of that, I think you raised a larger question of Indian exceptionalism.
Yeah.
As we discussed, I can also ask you questions, so it's not going to be one-way street.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
sort of broad question. I'm just thinking about this whole idea of indexes, and of course, there's a huge debate in India around this issue of using indexes of various kind, right? And you're seeing some of the international comparisons being done, and how India has responded to some of those comparisons, right? I think broad question is there are multiple indexes. There's a Freedom House Index. There's a one by the Cato Institute. There is one from. There's an echo going on. From Fraser Institute, right? There are multiple indexes, of course, not just on economic freedom, but also on other issues. Quality of justice system. There's a separate index for that, right? So just looking around all of these indexes that we have, is there something that we could comment on in terms of how useful or not so useful are these efforts which are being made by lots of groups around the country, around the world?
Well, I mean, there's two ways to look at these kind of indices, or which eventually lead to some kind of ranking. I mean, one is to worry about where you stand, and if you stand lower than what you expect, then you're not happy. And obviously, in any ranking, the person who's at the bottom, especially with the subjective ranking, it's not based on one examination, which can be relatively objectively judged. All of these indices ultimately have some amount of subjectivity and value judgment. So, but I look at them more positively, because I mean, we're not really saying that India is the number one country in the world. At least I'm talking from an Indian point of view in everything, right? Okay, we have a lot of things going for us. We are fifth. There are certain objective indicators which are in our favor: fifth largest economy, second largest population, fine. But I mean, start looking at per capita and so on, we rank relatively low. And then you get to ultimately all of us have one objective, which is to make India prosperous, right? Preferably the whole world prosperous at the same time, but definitely we want to see India move much faster towards prosperity. And I think their index or no index, I think there's a fair bit of evidence that certain indicators of at least economic freedom, or even legal freedom, and perhaps even political freedom, though that's probably the most contentious in terms of whether that delivers prosperity or not. But at least economic freedom, I think I don't find any country which has achieved prosperity without having a significant degree of economic freedom. So I find this particular index that I mean, and as you said, there are several, and each has their plus points and minus points. But what I liked about this is that you can there are very specific criteria, and I think sometimes it's really with legal freedom under pointed out facts, and I think this is very constructive. And as you said, the low hanging fruit, things can be done about them. So I think it's in that sense. This is not but what you've written in this chapter and this whole volume is not one of those beauty contests. Some of the indices end up being that, just, done for the sake of showing something up and something down. But I think this one really has more meaning, and certainly would give very concrete pathways to, move India ahead in the right direction. So I think I look at those indices which are constructive, which tell me a little more than what I already know, that India is behind on certain indicators, or it's ahead on certain indicators. Not very useful. This is very useful because it tells me how I can get, or policymakers or investors or whoever all of us together can, move India in the right direction.
I think, yeah, I agree with you that this you can always sort of learn by comparing, and it turns out that there are quite a few economic freedom indexes, and they seem to be giving somewhat similar picture of what has been working and what needs to be done. Right. I think to just get back to your question about the legal freedom, what I thought I will do is just put up on the screen the list of points that you raised, which obviously people would not be able to remember in the audience. So I think here are the sort of three components. Let me do a slide. And so there are three types of freedom: economic freedom, political freedom, and legal freedom. So these are components that we identify compared to those three averages: global average, lower middle income country average, and the South Asia average. So this is where India is lower than all of the three averages. These are the areas in terms of economic freedom. Then this is the political. I think this is the one that you raised. I think this is what I found also most useful in this exercise, is the areas where India is not doing as well in the legal freedom arena, right? And what's important about some of these things is that it's hard to argue about them, right? You'll have to find anybody who will say people should not have access to civil justice and it should be affordable, right? So unlike many of the other freedoms where that could be a philosophical, ideological, or even sometimes a very pragmatic difference of opinion, I think most of these parameters of legal freedom, I think would have a pretty good consensus across political party lines, across ideologies and philosophies, which is why I thought this can become sort of an important piece of the puzzle that India can focus on in terms of what India can do to improve prosperity of its people. Right.
So I think
your broad
it's
question
very
is
interesting. Yeah, very interesting, Alten. I think my at least one initial question was that, is there any contradiction or necessary clash between the first, which is easy access, and delays? I mean, if 1.4 billion people or a large proportion of them have to access, a system which is, X, is that, I mean, there may be many reasons for delays, but possibly just the burden of litigation across the board. The government is a bit litigant, all of, in a democratic society, I guess, we all go to courts for our rights. So is there anything, or that just one of those Indian exceptionalism arguments?
No, I think, of course, no. I mean, we know that this is not an easy thing to achieve. And of course, many countries have taken a much longer time to provide reasonable degree of access to timely and fair justice, right? But I think among the things we can look at broadly, say in economic reforms area, right? The political, one can argue about that political democracy area and the legal area. So legal area is a lot more specific, right? This is a particular system in place, which is very narrowly defined, right? Is of course much smaller number of people involved in terms of running of the system and maintenance of the system, right? So I think it seems like among what we could do, this is a sort of a doable arena of engagement, right? And so I think one way to think about this is that there are few people who have to make decisions about the legal system, how it's structured, right? For example, take the delays. Now, it's not just because of the fact that we are contentious society and we file too many lawsuits, right? It's just the procedures. We now a lot of research being done on those things. The procedure the court follows, it itself creates these delays, right? And there are easy ways, and I think more acceptable ways of dealing with those delays and removing from the system altogether. So my sense is that in most of these areas, we do have some good empirical evidence in terms of why these things happen. And so we have understanding of that. And I think we can create some consensus around the reform ideas. Then it seems reasonably easy to put them in place, given the fact there is a much narrowly defined part of the bureaucracy and the system that we are dealing with. Right?
Yeah, in fact, I think even recently, the Chief Justice Chandrachud remarked to lawyers that he doesn't want the Supreme Court or the court system to become a tariq pe tariq, what he, that it's also, I think, probably the only, I can see the only interest, the only vested interest, maybe lawyers who gain more fees by seeking adjournments or maybe even, certain interests. But as you said, philosophically, ideologically, whether it's the government or top judiciary, they should have no in principle objection to doing some of these things or getting them right. Whereas, as you said, on economic freedom, there may be arguments about tariffs or capital controls. But here, at least that shouldn't be there, is what you're saying.
Yeah. I think the point that you made about lawyers maybe losing out if you take away the delays that happen in the system. So my sense is that that's also, maybe we can have evidence on that. I don't think lawyers earn any less in the countries, right? Relatively speaking, compared to other groups in those societies, any less than Indian lawyers, where the systems are far speedier, right? And of course, easy to deal with for the public. So lawyers, I think, would be able to make money either way. Either they make money. So it looks like old argument about change in technology, that you have to preserve the old ways of doing things just to keep those jobs, right? And I think lawyers probably are thinking along those lines.
Yeah, and in fact, you mentioned technology. I suspect that technology would immensely help streamlining a lot of this stuff, which otherwise things moving on paper. And in fact, I think even the government now uses a lot of technology in a lot of things. So I think you certainly, in that sense, it's low hanging fruit. The other point number 5, I was wondering if you had a view on public disclosure of finances and business dealings by members of parliament. So I think, we have some amount of disclosure at the time of elections and so on, but I'm not sure how effective it is. In terms of the larger, when we talk about state capacity or the vested interest influencing policy or the corruption of the system. Again, I think you and I would probably agree that fundamentally, if the government did lesser things and had lesser discretion, then in other words, if people had more freedom, entrepreneurs had more freedom, then some of these things would be less problematic anyway.
Exactly. I think we do have, as you know, requirements of disclosure, but there is no verification of that, right? Nobody actually checks what you disclose is accurate or not, right? So yes, you put something out there, hopefully it's not too obviously false that anybody can easily pick on. You're going to be okay with it, right? So I think in some cases, my feeling is that no, if we require something under the law, then we should be able to pursue that to the fullest extent, right? Otherwise, it's a mockery of law, right? So one, I think, thing we do not want to do, I think that's really, I see that one of the key challenges in India, that have too many laws, which we cannot even properly enforce, right? And therefore, even some of the key laws also come in the same bucket. Hota hai, chalta hai, kar diya to theek hai, nahi kiya to kya fark padega, right? So I think that attitude that in the legal arena particularly, so I think if we have a law, then it has to be properly enforced. We should have this state capacity, as you very well pointed out. And that certainly is a key challenge in the area. My sense is that we should be able to spend a lot more money on judicial system than probably anything else. It's a far more defined expenditure that one can easily track. One can link some of those expenditures to the improvement in performance, right? So I think in many ways, these legal reforms are, in a sense, low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
And if you can get alignment among the Supreme Court judges and larger bureaucracy, legal bureaucracy, we should be able to move
In fact, an interesting thing on when you said about verification of finances and assets and so on, and the one thing I heard is that now, so commonly we assume that people will undervalue whatever assets they have when they declare it, but I'm told now that at the start of, say, political careers or bureaucratic careers, people actually give a higher declaration of assets in the assumption that they will accumulate that much over time. So even at the start, you need to verify, whether they were actually that well. So the point is verification is important. Otherwise, disclosure doesn't mean very much. So I think that's a point well taken. And just, in your previous slide, there was a point on, the political freedom, but, it kind of applies more also to, state capacity, is, on the sanctioning of errant officials. I think that was the point. Again, I'm just wondering, what the balance here is, because, every time one sees, bureaucrats being or officials being prosecuted for misdemeanors or corruption or something like that, then there's a fear psychosis that seeps into the system and paralyzes kind of decision making. So I mean, I'm sure other countries again do a reasonable job of being able to balance this. Is it again a function of the judicial system more than anything else, that you get more accurate investigation, faster delivery of justice rather than anything else?
I think I do think so. If you look at, for example, prosecutions that happen, not just, I mean, one which is, of course, widely watched of Donald Trump in the US, right? A former president in the country is getting prosecuted. You can see how that whole process moves, right? And I mean, you can imagine what would have happened in India if any of the former prime minister was under investigation in a similar situation, right? And I think so. It is about, I think, the capacity of the judiciary, right? And I think of course, it happened in the UPA too, right? We all sort of worried about and talked about the paralysis that government suffer after the few of the scams, rightly or wrongly, came in the public domain. And of course, and then we talk to people in the government, they all talk about that I have to keep watching my back every time I take a decision on some of the more critical, more somewhat controversial areas of focus. But I think in all of those cases, if you have clearly defined procedures, laws, and speedy justice, one could argue that it would not lead to as much paralysis as it does. And I think as you said, we begin to use technology, we reduce human interface between the bureaucracy and the citizens, right? All of that can slowly move in the same direction, and hopefully sort of, in a sense, virtuous cycle. One sort of fits into the other, and therefore we need less and less of actual threat of prosecution to be able to get right incentives for the people in the government.
Yes, I think just giving my 2 bits here, one of the very crucial reforms, I think, in terms of the economic freedom, which is not necessarily over here, but in terms of government running business, I think in a lot of most democratic countries, governments at some point used to run business, but most of them don't now, and certainly not the number of businesses that are run in India. And of course, we hear this uniquely Indian phraseology of disinvestment rather than privatization, or strategic disinvestment rather than privatization, because you can't say the privatization word. But I think one of the reasons it doesn't happen, despite at least this prime minister for the last 9 years has been saying government has no business to be in business, but yet we see the only company privatized was Air India. And one of the things I'm told, which again doesn't help the process, is the fact that bureaucrats who have to execute the entire thing worry about what will be said later, because if you sell an asset at any point in time, it has a certain value. Now that value may, if it's privatized, is likely to go up anyway because it will be more efficiently run. But in any case, I mean, you can't judge decisions in hindsight, because hindsight is perfect, and things happen which change things. But I think again, this fear of taking certain decisions in the bureaucracy is also coming in the way of unleashing some of the economic freedoms that India needs. I mean, that's something I've noticed, so I thought I would mention. The other thing, I mean, since it's our favorite topic as economists, economic freedom. So I think the one thing which a lot of people will say a fair amount of consensus is held around the economic reforms that were started in 91. And, not too many things have been reversed, except tariffs. I think there was a 25-year period where, they went down pretty much uniformly across the board, not to zero in all cases, but, to a reasonable level. And now we see a, revival of not only the tariff, but as you said, standard deviation. Some are very high, some are not so high. We all know, of course, tariffs protect domestic industry or domestic producers. They also lead to rent seeking and so on. But given the mood path in the world, where everyone's turning against free trade and globalization, and everyone wants to be Atmanirbhar in their own ways. How do you read this? You read this as something which is inevitable, that this is a phase of the global economy where things are going to go this way, or do you think we should go again, buck the trend?
So I think one way to just look back in the just last 30-40 years, right? People say from 1980s onwards, we sort of entered this new phase of globalization, right? And of course, say up to 2015 or so. So that's about 45-year period. And one can argue, yes, there are countries that did suffer during this transition. But you can also look at the 1.4 billion people or so of China, right? The poverty rates declined substantially in China from what it was in 1980s, right? You can argue the same thing about India, and of course, quite a few countries around the world. And countries that did participate in this globalization process have done overall quite well for themselves, right? So I think judging globalization by looking at what happens in Western Europe or United States, right, where obviously the decline in manufacturing jobs, and there's a lot of debates around that also, has created challenges, as we know, but they are not inherent in the economic system, right? So opioid crisis in the US, which is linked to the loss of jobs, and therefore people sort of feeling so depressed and feeling that there is no much future for themselves. I mean, it's also linked to the policies of the government of the US in terms of what they allow for consumption, and how the opioids are being distributed, who can prescribe them, right? So I think in many cases, one can look a little deeper, and what is being sort of construed as a global narrative, that this is all because of globalization, right? I think it's, first of all, is one-sided. It doesn't take into account the benefits that accrue to billions of people around the world, right? And they are really the one who are the biggest beneficiary of that. And secondly, I think is sort of looking at the wrongs, not analyzing the problems of the Western countries in a genuine manner. There are other reasons why this is happening in those countries, and maybe government could have addressed that. Yeah. Actually, my personal point of view is that most of the damage has been done, which is sort of blame on globalization or blame on economics, right? Now there's a whole movement about changing economics and challenging economics as a discipline altogether, right? Is that I think I see mostly as a political failure than an economic failure, right? I think political systems that we have are not evolving, right? We can imagine what has changed in our political system in the last 70 years, right? Yeah. Or any other country for that matter, right? So I think the ossification is largely in the political arena of our life. And that's where there is hardly any debate about what needs to change, right? We know the democracy as we have structured them are not delivering what people expect that they deliver, right? Of course, it's not to say that we should abandon democracy, but just like we think about improving economic system, we have to think systematically and deeply about how to improve our democratic systems.
Yeah, interesting point. But let me provoke you a little on the economic freedom part. So we've had the big global financial crisis of 2008, and again, the irony you pointed out is very valid. That crisis originated in finance, as you know, and Wall Street, and the politics took a turn against trade and immigration. So trade and immigration didn't really have much to do with that crisis, but I think the backlash went there, and in many ways, finance is back to where it was. But given that we saw that big crisis, given that we saw what happened in COVID, again, perhaps the systems, as you said, the political systems were not nimble enough to deal with that pandemic. So many lives were lost. Whatever. I mean, maybe it was inevitable, but one way or the other, I think there's a disenchantment, as you said, perhaps even with the state, and with capitalism, maybe in its the turn it took in the late 2000s. And in India, we tend to look for arguments to remain close. So we'll say, look, they went too far. We don't even want to liberalize our financial sector, whereas our financial sector is nowhere close to. So just again, because we are all part of global debates now. So when something happens in the West or things are happening in the West, we are influenced here as well. So again, to the point, how do we, convince people here, our stakeholders, that we still need. Those guys have their own debates, but we still unambiguously need more markets or more economic freedom, whether it's finance or trade or whichever domain you look at, the capital. But given all this that happens globally, how do we do it?
I think one point I'm always sort of surprised by in terms of discussion about the financial systems, right? And how fragile those are. And you ask yourself, which sector of the economy, even in the Western countries, they will not even come to Africa or South Asia, right? Which sector of the economy is most highly regulated, right? So you look at even the Western European American system, you'll find that the finance systems are most highly regulated. If you look at the degree of laws and regulations that apply to a financial system, is unparalleled compared to any other industry in those countries, right? So the argument somehow that finance systems are sort of free for all and the laissez-faire, and that laissez-faire is creating all these problems for us, right, is factually incorrect, right? If you look at regulations which apply to all the industries, and you see where it's the most regulated industry is the financial industry. And that's true in almost any country for that matter, not just in Western countries, right? So I think, first of all, is a false argument that laissez-faire is what's creating these problems in the finance, and which is, of course, translating into problems in trade and other areas which affects the real human life, right? Secondly, it's also true, right, as we discussed earlier, that look at the experience of countries around the world, almost each and every one of them, and how they have grown, right? There are some first principles, right? So it cannot be that everything is up for grab, right? Yeah. You can see there are, we can of course disagree about at the margin, but there are certainly first principles that do tell you that some of those basic things have to be done. And if you don't do that, you are not going to be able to do well economically, right? And I think my sense is that trade is one of the old truths. There's one area in economics where economists across political spectrum, right, agree on, is that trade is always beneficial to the parties who engage in it. And actually, we say double thank you moment. When I buy something, you sell me something, we both say thank you, right? Yeah. We would not engage in that transaction unless we both thought we are benefiting by it, right? Yeah. So I think it's one of those classic example of voluntary exchange. And therefore, it's hard to argue that somehow we are hoodwinked into doing trade, which is not in our interest.
Yeah. But then why this? What's the appeal of self-reliance or doing everything on your own? Is it that people don't understand? Is it the rest of the world versus economists, or what is the?
No, I think what Hayek has pointed out. There is sort of microcosm. So the life that we live, maybe life of the family, right, that we intimately are engaged with. And there's a macrocosm, which is the life of the larger economy and society, right? And often we see what works in our personal life in a way, or how we manage family. We think that, okay, the way to govern society is just expand the way we manage our families, right? Now, families we manage very differently, right? There is no meritocracy in a family, right? So in a family is very socialistic pattern of governance, right? Person who is not doing so well is the person who gets most help in the family, right? But that's not how you want to run society as a whole. So I think I see that interesting sort of paradox, what we immediately understand and how we conduct ourselves, which is true. This is how we behave in our sort of microcosm, right? And we extend that argument to the larger macrocosm. And that's where the paradox is, that's where the challenge is. How do I think differently about the larger complex systems versus I think about my own family and my own business?
Yeah, that's very interesting. And just before, we have to move, I guess, shortly to the Q&A, but, the one other important indicator, which I don't want to uh, miss, is the on women, like women in the workforce and, equal pay or doing tasks that are normally reserved for men. Now, in India, I think the data, again, people debate this data, but I think it would be fair to say that, we are below several averages, and your chapter also, suggests that. Uh, you know, is it? I mean, is there again a paradox here that as we've become a little more prosperous than we were 20 years ago, women have dropped out of the workforce, or is that not correct? I mean, what's going on, and what is the low hanging fruit here that we can do to, because I mean, women are 50% of the population, so they must also in their contribution to GDP. I understand there's a lot of unpaid work that women do, and all of that is there, but still, I think we certainly could do with a lot more women in the workforce.
Very true. I think it certainly is an interesting challenge for us. Because there are, I think, many dimensions to how women participate or not participate in the larger economy, larger society, and also in our political system, for that matter, not just economic system. And I think, again, there, the legal part does give you a very good way to intervene. Now, it may not be sufficient by itself. You would need something more than that. But for example, simple thing about not allowing women to work after at night.
Yeah.
And we still have some of those laws on the books, right? Yes, some states have reformed the Shops and Establishment Act and made those changes. But there are many areas where legally women are not allowed to work, right? And I think simple legal reform of that kind, just weeding out those restrictions that we have put in place, however justifiable they may have been 100 years ago, 50 years ago, right? So I think that certainly is one area I can see we should be able to at least remove the hurdles, right? As they say about doctors, first do no harm. I mean, you can't help women actively, at least stop doing whatever harm you are doing by stopping them from what they can do for themselves, right? So I think that's one. Just this weekend, we had a program at the Indian School of Public Policy campus, and Dr. M.C. Saxena, the former IS officer, who has been also very active in research and advocacy after retiring. So he was pointing out that we made about inheritance laws, women being able to inherit property, and who has a claim on, say, your parents' property, right? Obviously, only men, the sons, are allowed to claim, but not the daughters, right? So he said, okay, we changed the Hindu sort of personal law, right? Amended the clause, which now allows obviously equal participation of daughters as sons, right? But he was pointing out there are states even today where the state law prohibits that. And one can argue that central law should supersede, and in theory it does, but in practice, obviously, you have to amend those state laws also. So he actually pointed out quite rightfully, and the UP and I think Haryana both have state laws about inheritance. And it's not always about inheritance written that way. So I think UP has a law in terms of the land distribution. Okay. And that's where they limit only sons can get the land and not the daughters, right? So I think there are a lot of this historical, I think, legacy that we have on our law books, which need to be cleared up. Yes, they may not be themselves by enough, but I think that's really first step we should be able to do, and should be a lower hanging fruit.
Yeah. No, I mean, one very interesting thing that I have from personal observation again was that one of the things that was not allowed for women until, I think a year and a half ago, was working in underground mining. It was prohibited. I think Rajasthan perhaps changed the law, and now, I've seen in my company Vedanta, there's entire team and team leaders who are women and quite happy to do that work. So as you said, sometimes it's just about removing those barriers, and there's nothing else you need to do because they're already. I mean, of course, you guys in different professions and different areas, you need different things, but there are a lot of things which will happen quite quickly if you were to remove those barriers, and of course give them equal pay as their male counterparts and so on. So I think I think that the point you make about removing the obstacles is quite important. So I just, are there any questions from the audience? We can, and of course, I'm happy to carry on this wonderful chat, but Sanskriti.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. We actually, to make it a little interesting, what we did was that while we circulated the registration link, we asked people if they had any questions for the panelists, and we picked out, the most interesting ones. And it'll be really amazing to, have answers to them. So, the first question is, how could underdeveloped countries uplift their economy that depends only on remittance and workforce migration? So yes, Dhiraj sir, you and Parth, either of you can answer this question.
Is a question is that if you're dependent on migration and
Remittance.
remittances, what do we do? What do we need to do
Yeah,
to
how,
improve that?
yeah, how could
I think
underdeveloped countries
one
uplift
way
their
to, I mean,
economy?
I'll let Parth give the kind of more fundamental answer, but one of the ways to look at remittances and migration is that they're labor exports. One of the things that India constantly fights for, and I think rightly so, is that we allow free movement of goods and capital. You should have relatively free movement of labor as well. At the end of the day, it should also move and be able to earn its which I wouldn't say it's necessarily a problem. I mean, I think at least for India, there are certain states, Kerala for example gets a lot of, even for the macro economy, the amount of remittances we get. I think we are the largest recipients, a lot larger than China also, from our workforce outside. So I think it's a positive contributor to the economy. I mean, I assuming the question uh, is that if that's the only source, but then I mean that would suggest that something is very wrong with your country if everybody has to go outside to work. And the one place I've heard, again anecdotally, is what is called Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Apparently there are certain locations where everyone has migrated to the UK or somewhere else because there are no economic opportunities there, but you have massive palatial mansions and all which they've built with the remittances and so on. So there's not much economic activity, but still something comes back. But I think in a country like India, I would say migration and remittances are positive things. So I mean I wouldn't worry too much. But Parth, if
Yeah.
you have
No, I think I fully agree with you, Dhiraj. I think that why would you complain about earning income that people can earn by working abroad or wherever else they're able to work, right? I think that's one of the downside of WTO becoming less relevant now, right? So if you look at, I think in some ways, WTO focused on opening up the manufactured goods, uh, and capital controls, right? They were focused on those areas. Slowly they came to services and then agriculture, which was one of the contentious areas, right? And they never actually became very clear about the labor, right? Human movement across borders. And I thought that was the next step, if you think about it in the sequence, which is where we should have been very active. And the sort of so-called global South should have be raising a lot of noise on that front. That now making WTO irrelevant is really unfair to us. We participate in that with the understanding that slowly everything would become open, including a labor movement, right? And when the time came for that, WTO just disappeared. So I think it's certainly, one can argue as a conspiracy theory that the Western countries, which had, of course, large role to play in sustaining the global trading system, sort of played one way, right? They sort of benefited largely themselves in what got opened up in some sense. Obviously, I'm not against that. We know trade benefits both parties. But I think now it would have been a discussion around labor, and which is where WTO could have played an important role, just like it played in capital and goods and services.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. The next question, it seems, is from a person who has thoroughly read the book and has asked that the freedom and prosperity equation seems to assume that people in India have more political and legal freedom than people in South Korea. Is this a reasonable assumption? A. Also, though people in India can vote, Indian voters have very few options, and the person who has asked the question believes that people are also scared of going to the police and judiciary. So I can see there are two questions here. So, one, is it a reasonable assumption that people in India have more political and legal freedom as compared to people in South Korea? And B, do we have more options as Indian voters? So, yeah.
Dhiraj?
I mean, I think on the technical part, it would be better to answer, why South Korea has. I mean, I think again, South Korea in terms of, but again, I'm not talking with special reference to this book because I haven't read the South Korea chapter, but I mean, it's a relatively recent democracy compared to India, and as far as I understand, their legal judicial system is also quite challenging in many ways. So, of course, their economic freedom has always been, what has driven their thing. But I mean, Parth would be better able to answer in terms of relative ranking. In terms of choice, I mean, why would you say that Indian voters don't have choice? I mean, there's so many political parties, so many uh, independent candidates stand. We even have Nota now. If you want, you can reject all. So I think there is choice. I mean, not all of the choices may seem appealing to a particular voter that you may think that there's 9 out of the 10 are not up to your mark or so. But we still have much more choice than say UK or US, where there are two parties. There are two-party systems, or in much of Europe, it's two or three-party systems. So yes, we've always had one dominant party, but then in different states it's a different picture. So I think overall the system remains fairly pluralistic and choice, and we even had something like the Aam Aadmi Party coming up, where startup kind of experiment, which has now got power in two states. So I think where people are politically entrepreneurial, they can capture the voters' attention. I think there's a lot of scope to rise in India. I'm not underestimating the challenges of barriers to entry. Of course, you need a lot of organization, you need a lot of money. All of that is there. But I think despite all of that, I think we retain a reasonable degree of political choice, and I think let's also accept that voters do exercise it. Sometimes it may be choosing from two great alternatives. Sometimes maybe choosing the less bad of the two. That's the nature of democracy. So look at the US also. I mean, people are unhappy with both the candidates who are. I mean, if you believe the polls, but then they will choose. And the US is that way much more because they have a primary system and so on. So it's, an outsider, like ranked outsider like Obama can come up. But then you look at India, even Modi in many ways is a ranked outsider. Deva Gowda, he was not prime minister for long, ranked outsider. So we've had unlikely and interesting choices. So that would, but on the South Korea path, maybe you can.
No, good point. I think I really like the point that you made about the democracy, of course. And also, I think as we discussed just briefly earlier, that the current system of democracy is not God-given, right? This is something we created, meaning is a human creation. And one can think of, and there are many ideas on the table in terms of how you can improve the working of the democracy even further, right? I think we need to sort of focus on that part of it to open the democracy to the ordinary people who can also equally participate in the process as opposed to what we have currently. And there are many experiments being done around the world which show that it can be done, right? So that's, of course, one part. I mean, South Korea, my sense is that, of course, for the data that we have in the Atlantic Council Index, I think is only from 2006 to 2020-21, right? So it is more recent data. So if you're going by the data itself, obviously the history of India's democracy is not getting captured. And it's possible that South Korea looks far more appealing in the recent times in terms of the political freedom than India does. But of course, India has a much longer history of democracy. We also know that South Korea actually has put two of the former prime ministers, right,
Yes.
in jail.
Indeed, yeah.
I mean, you're talking about legal system and working of legal system, right? Whatever you may say, I mean, the fact remains that there are two former prime ministers who are sitting in jail.
Great. Thank you so much, sir. That was really helpful. We have one question in the Q&A box, which I think it is when, sir, you were talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat and the concept of self-reliance. The question here is, hasn't COVID made a good case to not completely disregard self-reliance? So requesting your comments on this.
Well, I think in many ways, fundamentally for me, COVID made the opposite case because, it was a time when you needed, incredible amount of, and I think some of it fell short, global cooperation because, not everybody is ever going to make their own vaccine, right? It's not going to happen. I mean, India can, maybe China can, but literally six or seven, and India also relied on 90% of the vaccinations here came from the Oxford AstraZeneca. So, I mean, in terms of, doing it all yourself, I think in India, sometimes we consider it because we are large. But as Parth made the point earlier, China, despite being very large, chose to go the international route and capture international. So international markets will always be much, much larger. The size of the global merchandise trade market, this is a point Arvind Panagria used to makes often, is 18 trillion, and India's GDP itself is 3.6 or 3.7 trillion, right? At that much. So even if you are not, even if you increase your share, India's is maybe two. If you double it, that's a huge thing. So I think the the gains from trade are still, immense. And I think sometimes self-reliance seems like an option for maybe large or rich countries, but it's not an option for most countries because most countries are not going to be able to make everything. And in India, we already tried, the entire self-reliance thing. That's what we did for 40 odd years. And we may have produced a lot of things, but not efficiently. We didn't get quality. You didn't get things on time. So, all of that matters. Quality matters, price matters, the entire system's robustness matters. So I think, certainly some things are changing in the world and, people are looking at security of supply chain and so on. But I still think even there's going to be cooperation among like-minded countries. Maybe not the kind of across the board globalization of the past 30, 40 years, but, the Quad, for example, is looking at India, Japan, Australia, US on mineral supplies, certain other things. So I think complete self-reliance is not an option. Even for India, I mean, we've been importing 90% of our oil. We import, all of our lithium and so on. So, I mean, certain things will happen, certain things won't. So I think for me, COVID actually made the case that we need to remain open and, the world needs trade to happen and technology to transfer.
I think that's really very well put, Dhiraj. I fully agree with you that to me also lesson looks quite the opposite than what most people are thinking about. I think, but also look at, for example, what we are doing in the name of self-reliance, right? So is our Indian companies becoming manufacturers of silicon chips, right? No, we are inviting Foxconn, right, to come here and set up a plant. This is a foreign company anyway, right? So I think even the idea of self-reliance is somewhat suspect from that point of view. You are not building internal capacity. You are simply getting manufacturing capacity. And one can argue that, of course, the foreign company also has control over what happens in the company in any other country. So I think, again, I think self-reliance in this particular cases, as we are looking at, is also just encouraging foreign companies to open their manufacturing plants in India, right? Now, how is that going to really make that big a difference if you undermine the international trade? Because as we know, even for those things manufactured in India, parts of components are going to come from abroad, right? It's not going to be viable even for Foxconn, any other company, to produce everything from scratch in India or in China for that matter, right? So I think people need to just go a little deeper than the surface sloganeering to understand what we are actually doing, as opposed to just go by what people claim, say what they do.
So I have a slightly different, definition of self-reliance, in the sense that if you really want to be self-reliant, we have to be strong and competitive, right? And not closed. So, and I think this book and his chapter, very point out some very concrete areas where we can improve legal freedom, economic freedom. That's what will really make us self-reliant in the end. Where self-reliance doesn't mean making everything yourself. It means being strong, so that you make certain things and then you buy certain things. That's the way, prosperity is achieved. But yeah, so if you want to be Atmanirbhar, strengthen yourself rather than shut out the world. That would be my interpretation.
Thank you, sir. In the interest of time, we have one last question that we can take. Judicial system is an albatross around our neck. How can we reform it?
I think Parth can put up those 10 points. No, I think the larger point Parth made was that, we know what has to be done, and not too many people, nobody is going to really object in principle to cutting delays or giving better access, cheaper access, or, all of those, points that Parth had shown earlier. And relatively small constituency has to be convinced. As he said, senior judges, top bureaucracy, politicians. So compared to economic reform, where people will oppose free trade, where people will oppose free movement of capital, whatever. I mean, I think that's what the sense I got from reading and understanding what Parth has been saying. That, of course, and for both of us, I think when I read it, that's what really struck me. That how far behind we are on the legal system. So in that sense, the person says albatross around the neck. I mean, I can sympathize with the sentiment, but I think the reform ideas are there, and I think very concrete. Parth, you want to?
No, I think I fully agree. And I think now we also have quite a bit of evidence. There are lots of research institutes and, of course, academics who are looking at specific parts of the legal system and what's ailing that part, right? And we have good evidence that tells us how to fix those problems. So I think now it's hard to argue not against those reforms. I think both in terms of the humanitarian point of view, that we need to help people. Usually the people who suffer the most are the people at the sort of bottom of the pyramid, right? They are the ones who lack the access to justice system. And I think improving system has really a sort of huge moral sort of challenge. And I think we should be able to meet that challenge, right? And obviously in terms of what needs to be done, the technical part of it, technology is now available to scale. So once you figure out how to fix one part of the court system, you can apply it very easily to scale through technology, right? I think we have ways of now solving those problems more effectively.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Parth, Dhiraj. This was a wonderful discussion. And for everyone who haven't yet read the book, I have shared the link on the chat box. You can access its soft copy. And thank you again for joining. Thank you so much, Dhiraj and Parth, for taking out the time. This was indeed really helpful and absolutely, wonderful to learn more about your perceptions and insights on the topic. And yes, I wish everybody a great evening ahead. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dhiraj.
Thanks.